Okay, so we're just figuring out a couple little technical difficulties. There we go. So we want to get right. We want to get right to work, but yeah, right here. So how many of you all have seen the movie Stripes? Okay, so there's this great scene where Bill Murray has convinced Harold Ramis to join the army because their lives are just really down the tubes. So it's not going well in basic training, but they're giving them their new uniforms, and Bill Murray says, chicks in New York are paying top dollar for this stuff. Well, chicks in New York spend a lot of money to get to see John Stonestreet. And we get to see him this morning just because he's here.
All right, we're all plugged in and ready to go, and Don, thanks so much for that introduction. So the topic of the morning is Christian worldview, and when we talk about Christian worldview, what we mean by worldview is essentially, is what Don subtitled it, which is how Christians see the world, but that's not exactly accurate. When we talk about Christian worldview, we're not talking about how Christians see the world. We're talking about how Christians should see the world, and that's not exactly the same thing. And hopefully that'll make sense here as we go along. Let me, to really talk about Christian worldview well, we have to talk about worldview. Like, what do we mean by worldview? The first thing you need to know is this: everyone has a worldview. So everyone look to your left and say, you have a worldview. Now look to your right and say, I have a worldview. Yeah, I know, it's strange to talk to the back of someone's head, but a worldview is something that humans have. It's not something that animals have. It's something that is part of who we are as people. So one of the questions to think about when we talk about worldview is not, do I have a worldview, but which worldview do I have? Not, do I have a frame of reference through which I can see the world, but which frame of reference do I have through which I see the world? Let me give you, there's a lot of different ways to define worldview. Let me give you the one that I like the best, and it's because it's the one from my book. A worldview is the framework of basic beliefs that we have, whether we know it or not, that shapes our view of and for the world. Let me focus in on a couple different key parts of this definition. The first one is this: whether we know it or not. If you went up to the average person on the street and you said, what's your worldview? They would walk away from you, okay? They would try to get away, unless you were in Manitou, and then it would make perfect sense. But in most parts of the world, people don't think about worldview. But people don't think about their worldview because people don't think about their contact lenses. Does that make sense? Like when I put contacts in, I forget that I have them. It doesn't mean they go away. I'm spending the rest of my day seeing everything through whatever prescription has been built into those lenses. So a worldview, the reason we don't actually think about it is not because it's not there. It's because a worldview is like a pair of glasses or a pair of prescription contact lenses. It's not something you hardly ever look at. It's something that you're always looking through, right? And what are we looking through? We're looking through that framework of basic beliefs, right? Here's one of the things that are different about humans than about animals. All animals care about is where they're going to find their next meal, where they're going to find their next nap, and where they're going to find their next mate. I was going to say college students, but yes, this is what animals think about. But if you go even to the most primitive cultures on the planet, it's not just that they're trying to survive. This was one of the, I think, real misses of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution when he was just basically explaining all living things from a survival instinct. This is one of the most, one of the fascinating things. I once met a guy and got to know a guy who worked for a missions organization called New Tribes, okay? And what New Tribes did is they went to new tribes. They went to completely unreached people. And I don't mean unreached with the gospel. I mean unreached by any kind of touch of civilization. And then would find out their cultural narratives, the cultural myths, the stories that would dominate. And you know what? It doesn't matter where you go. If there's plenty of resources for a group of people to live off of, or if there's no resources for people to live off of, people are doing more than just living off their resources. They're thinking about it. They're asking questions. They don't just exist. They ask these big questions of life. Questions like, does life have meaning? And how should I live? And what happens when I die? And what's right and wrong? And who makes the rules? And how do I know? And where is history headed? There's different ways to frame these questions, but philosophers tend to call these the ultimate questions, okay? Every book that explains worldview will have their own different list of these questions. But everywhere you go, wherever humans exist, they ask questions like, where did I come from? Why am I here? Your cat does not ask that. Right? Your cat doesn't sit around going, do all dogs go to heaven? This isn't what animals ask. This is what humans ask. And there's different ways to frame these. Leo Tolstoy, for example, the great Russian novelist, listed out 7 of these questions. And he said, if I don't find answers to these 7 questions, I'm going to kill myself. So guess what he did? No, he became a Christian, you pessimist. Yeah. Now, there's different ways to frame them out, but let me give you some categories of questions. When we talk about this framework of basic beliefs, what we're talking about is these fundamental questions that all humans ask. And I think you can pretty much put them in one of 5 categories, right? Questions having to do with origin. Where did everything come from, right? This is one of the uniqueness of the human experience. We not only note that we exist, we wonder why we exist. And is there a God? And how do I know? And where did everything come from? All right? Identity. What does it mean to be human? Who am I and who are we? How are we different than the animals, right? Why am I the sort of person that I am? Where does my sense of creativity and human dignity and all these sorts of things come from? Meaning. This is kind of the great question, right? What's worth getting up in the morning for? What's life all about? What makes life worth living? As many people would say, you can live without food for a set amount of time. You can live without water for a set amount of time, but you can't live hardly any time at all without meaning, right? If you don't know why you're doing it, what's worth getting up for? Morality. What's right and wrong? Who sets the rules? Is there a transcendent source, like a God, that tells us what's right and wrong? Or is it just kind of whatever we think is right and wrong? Or is it just whatever the king or whatever the government says is right and wrong? There's all kinds of answers to these questions. And then, of course, questions of destiny, right? Not just what happens when I die, but where's history headed? If you think about it, some of the most powerful ideas that have shaped the world, especially the 20th century, if you look just at the 20th century, some of the most powerful ideas that have shaped the world are ideas that were driven by a vision of utopia, right? You know what that word utopia means? What's utopia mean?
Nothing.
What? A paradise, a perfect world. So if you look at Marxism was driven, communism was driven by this idea that the world was headed to a perfect state. How'd that work out, by the way? Yeah. I'm just old enough to remember. Nuclear drills. Now, a bunch of you did nuclear drills, I'm sure, right? Right? In case of a nuclear attack, get under your desk, right? Made great sense. So when I was like 9 years old, and I can't remember all the context for this, but it was right before, Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so it was, big fear of nuclear war. And so PBS did a kids documentary on nuclear weapons. Sounds like a great plan, doesn't it? It was all done through stick figures. And they explained, this is what happens when an atomic bomb goes off. First, the heat will be so great, it'll melt your skin off your body and you'll die. And this little stick figure just disintegrates, right? Yeah, so get under your desk. It'll work great. Okay. Now, so when I say basic beliefs, again, you go up to the average person on the street and say, hey, what's your worldview? And they're going to look at you and try to get away, right? But if you strike up a conversation, you say, hey, what makes life worth living for you? Or, tell me about yourself. Who are you? Or, hey, what do you think? Do you think this is right, or do you think it's wrong to fill in the blank, right? And when you ask those questions, that's what I mean by basic beliefs. To be human, and by the way, the Scripture tells us why, right? The Scripture tells us that God has placed eternity in our hearts. So we don't just think about the here and now, we think about beyond the here and now. That makes us different than the animals right off the bat. And because we do that, we have a worldview. Doesn't mean it's a well thought out worldview, but we have one. And these basic beliefs, by the way, aren't just kind of random things. How we think about them come together and form our little framework of who we are. By the way, did you like that? That's pretty impressive, isn't it? That took 3 hours of my life that I'll never get back, so let's watch that again. Huh? Come on, there we go. Yeah, and that's, in other words, how you answer one question affects how you answer another question. Probably the most dramatic example of this that I can think of is, I've been thinking a lot about this, actually, in light of, did you guys hear a couple weeks ago they caught a young man who was planning to blow up a synagogue in Pueblo? Did you guys hear this? And if you actually look at it, Colorado has more than its share of what we would call, I kind of put them in two categories: acts of desperation, like violence, and what's called deaths from despair, right? Which is a code word now we're using nationally to describe overdoses, and you know what I mean? And Colorado has more than its share of both of those, just for the record. But the first, obviously, example of that act of desperation was Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris at Columbine High School. And Columbine, by the way, just got to the state championship, right? Football? Did anybody know? Okay, never mind. All right, I was just seeing this yesterday. But anyway, so this is back over 20 years ago. And remember initially that explanation that came out is that these kids were bullied and they played too much violent video games? And none of that, well, I don't know if they played violent video games, but really none of that turned out to be true. What turned out to be true is that they had become students of a philosophical system called nihilism. And nihilism is just a way of saying that the world has no meaning. Nihilism means nihilo, the word means nothing, so it's kind of the philosophy of nothingism. Life has no meaning, life has no purpose. And by the way, if you think life has no meaning and no purpose, then how does that impact morality? It eliminates it. There's no reason to live by anybody's moral rules, especially if you're going to shoot people and then shoot yourself. Who's going to get you in trouble if this life has no meaning? You see what I mean? So how you answer one of these questions will impact dramatically how you answer all the rest. Now again, it doesn't mean that people have actually sat down and thought this through, that they've actually wrestled through what it is that they believe. But this framework of basic beliefs then drives how we live. So you can think about it in terms of a triangle. At the basis of how we experience the world, how we live with each other, how we talk to each other, how we interact, how we work, whatever we do, is our worldview. And that worldview drives our values, right? We talk a lot in our country about we need to get back to values. We need to get back to values. We need to get back to values. No, the question isn't do we have values? The question is what? Which values? Or maybe even better, whose values? Whose values are we going to live by? Right? Adolf Hitler had values. Those aren't the ones that we want. Right? So, and then from our values come our actions. So we do the things that are important to us, and what's important to us is determined by our fundamental answers to these big questions of life. Who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Now again, you talk to most people on the street and you ask them to make these connections. They don't make these connections, but it doesn't mean that it's not shaping who they are and how they live. So let me give you some thoughts on worldview. Here's the first one. I use the picture there of glasses, but it's not just kind of how we see the world, it's also how we understand the world and our place in it. So it's not just kind of this passive activity of seeing. Based on how we see is how we live and how we interpret the world around us. I'll give you an example. Every few years we have, and we're in the middle of an uptick right now, there is an uptick of alarmism about the climate, okay? Some of you are old enough to remember the 70s when the big fear of the climate was global cooling, that we were going to drop so many temperatures and we were all going to be under ice, right? And then, of course, now the fear is global warming, which somehow is still going to put us all under ice according to that Al Gore movie. But never mind. All right, I have the spiritual gift of sarcasm, so I'm going to make fun of this just a little bit. Do you like that? I was speaking to a group of teachers once, and I used that example, and the evaluations I got back. One teacher wrote, "Sarcasm is not a spiritual gift." And she underlined it, put exclamation points. I just looked at it, I was like, no duh. But if you think about kind of what's behind an alarmism about the climate, right? The first thing you're assuming is that there is no supernatural force overseeing the story. Do you see what I mean? In other words, that human activity is not only changing things, but human activity has the capacity to cause catastrophic results. Secondly, if you believe that the world's on the precipice of disaster, kind of like, you know what I mean? Like we just do what you believe. If you believe that the entire story of the world is, as Richard Dawkins once said it, we shouldn't be here. In other words, like everything happened exactly right by chance in order to get us here, then you think that the universe, or the world as we know it, exists on very razor-thin margins, right? We can't breathe too many times without the whole thing going kablooey. That's the scientific term, kablooey, right? So you think that the world is perpetually in a state of potential crisis, that the margins for disaster, the margins for error are just razor thin. So too many greenhouse gases, too many this, too many that, too many cows, then this becomes a very, very fragile universe that we live in. So do you see how your worldview, the assumptions that you bring to the interpretive data will change, whatever your conclusion is, who we are and our place in it. Here's the second thing. It's not primarily seen in how we think. And the reason is because a lot of people just work really hard not to think, okay? But our worldview is really seen in how we live. One of my mentors, one of David's mentors, a guy named Bill Brown, he works for us at the Colson Center. He loves to say this, and I think it's a really powerful statement. You may not live what you profess, but you'll live what you believe. You may not live what you profess, but at the end of the day, you'll live what you believe. It'll come out. I'm not saying we're always consistent with all of our beliefs, but those gut-level thoughts about whether God really exists or not, that stuff is actually going to come out in how we live our lives, how we treat other people, and so on. And then this is my favorite line, and I wish I'd thought of it, but it comes from a buddy of mine in Australia. He says, your worldview is best understood not as which one you have, but which one has you. Which one actually holds you. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say a worldview, and that's what we mean when we say that everyone has one. But just because everyone has one doesn't mean people actually understand how it impacts their lives. So even though everyone has a worldview, most people don't think worldviewishly. Do you like that word? Made that one up, okay? Yeah. What we mean by worldviewishly is many people don't understand what it is that's driving how they're living in the world. What's driving their interaction with others. And we don't often think about, again, the worldview that we claim and all the consequences that it has for our lives. Years ago, I got an email from a guy that I used to work for over at Summit, David Noble, who founded that organization, and he said, hey, John, how would you like to go to New Zealand to speak at a conference down there? And I emailed him back, let me pray about it, yes. Some invitations are more obviously God's will than others. And that one was an easy one. And so anyway, I was really looking forward to it. Got to the airport, got an extra row seat on the flight down, right? Which was great because I was flying, cattle class. And so an exit row seat was God's gift. Had 12 hours, had a great time down there. Rushed to get back to the airport to catch my flight on the way back. Barely got to the airport in time. So guess what I did not get on the way back? Yeah, no exit row seat. Now, there's a wonderful story in the Bible about Elijah winning on Mount Carmel, and then like having this huge day of defeating the enemy, and then Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you, and he runs out into he had just seen God rain fire down from heaven, and then he runs out into the wilderness and pouts, because that's how we are. Like, your most vulnerable time is when you're really exhausted after a spiritual high, right? And so this is what was happening to me. I'm getting on the airplane. I'm sitting way back in row 647, and I'm going to be snuggled up to this lady for the next 12 hours of my life who I don't know, and I'm thinking to myself, God, why have you forsaken me? You know, I'm just really rational. And so I sit down next to this lady, and I figure if we're going to be snuggled up together, we should at least say hi. So I said, hey, where are you going? She said, I'm going to Orlando. I said, great, what's in Orlando? She said, I'm going to an Avatar conference. I said, well, what's an Avatar conference? And she said, an Avatar conference is a conference where they teach you how to find your truth. I said, what do you mean, how to find your truth? She said, well, we all have the truth we need inside of us. We just need to learn how to find it. And, we have so many people telling us what to believe, including, all these, religious people telling us what to believe, and all we need to do is look inside. Now, this was an example of someone not thinking worldviewishly, because the first thing that came to my mind is, lady, why are you flying halfway around the world for someone to tell you that the truth is already inside you, right? I mean, they sent you an email. You could save a couple $1,000, right? But I didn't say that. And so we were going back and forth and talking about this, and she kept telling me, John, you have all the truth inside you. John, you have all the truth inside you. John, don't let anyone tell you what's right and wrong. Don't let anyone tell you what's right and wrong. Now, what is she doing during this whole process? She's telling you what's right and wrong, yeah. And I knew where she was coming from. I didn't think she'd actually say it, but actually we were just about 30 minutes in the conversation, and she said, John, you have all the truth inside you because you are God. And I am God. And that flight attendant over there is God. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life. Never God. And I got to tell you, it's awkward. What do you say when someone calls you God? Like, thanks? I don't know. It's really strange. You don't really know where to go next. And, of course, I was just thinking to myself, if I was God, I'd have an exit row seat. But so she kept saying, John, look inside for your truth. Look inside for your truth. Now, here's an example of her not thinking worldview. She said, so what if I look inside to find my truth, and I discover what's true for me is to torture little babies for fun? And the people in front of us turned around. It's really awkward. If you're going to say crazy things like that, you got to keep your voice down. That's what I learned. But according to everything that she had said so far, that the truth is inside you, what should she have said? Hey, if it's right for you, it's right for you. You know what she said? Why do you have to talk in extremes? I said, well, why is that an extreme? She said, you don't believe that. I said, well, of course I don't believe that. That's obvious from our conversation. My question is, why don't you believe that? Because you said that the truth is inside you, right? So it's amazing how people don't think worldviewishly. Now, before we throw on these, crazy ladies that fly to Orlando from Australia or something like that they don't think worldviewishly, let me tell you really quickly how Christians don't think worldviewishly. Christians don't think worldviewishly because Christians have been convinced of two fundamental lies. When I say Christians have been convinced, I mean by and large, Christians have become convinced because they haven't been intentional about how their faith commitments drive their worldview. So they've embraced a worldview from around them, just from the culture around them. And the culture around us is screaming at us two fundamental things. And many, many Christians have just bought into it. Here's the first lie that most Christians believe, and that is that our Christian faith is not only personal, it's private. That our Christian faith is not only personal, but it's also private. Now, let me just tell you, I hope your Christian faith is personal. That's the brilliance of the whole season we're about to celebrate here in Advent. His name will be called Emmanuel, that is to say, God with us. There's a fun new book walking through all the characters of Christmas and how their story is elevated as part of the Jesus story. It's really well done. Christian faith is personal, but it's not private. When we say God exists, we don't mean we think God exists. What we mean is, in the universe, God actually exists. And the universe that we see is best explained by this premise that God exists. And it doesn't make any sense to say that God doesn't exist because of the design that we see. Do you see what I mean? In other words, it's a personally held belief that is based on a public truth. You guys are looking at me like I'm crazy. Is this making sense? Here's another thing. When we say Jesus rose from the dead, we don't mean we believe Jesus. I mean, I hope you believe Jesus rose from the dead, but that's not the claim. The claim is Jesus literally was dead, and then he came back to life 3 days later, and as Peter says, that means he's the king of everything. Like, these are public truths. The second lie that we've believed from our culture is not only that Christian faith is not only personal, it's also private, when what we're dealing with when we talk about Christianity is public truths. The second big lie is that everything, when it comes to morality and religion, is put into a separate category than things like science. In other words, this is what, can I use this? Francis Schaeffer talked about this. He talked about that there was this upper... I'm going to throw it at you again if it doesn't work. All right. He talks about how there's this upper story and a lower story of reality. And when we talk about this kind of a lower story of reality, we're talking about things that are real knowledge, right? This is stuff you can see, touch, taste, feel, smell, and hear. Stuff that can be sensed, stuff that can be measured and evaluated. A lot of you work in this area. It's what we call today basically science. And when we talk about science, we're talking about facts. We're talking about things that we can actually be sure of. There's a level of certainty right here. And we're talking about things that are external to our own belief in them, right? But whenever we start talking about morality, and by the way, the guy who we can blame on this is a German, okay? Immanuel Kant did all this to us. So, boo on him. Okay. If you don't know who I'm talking about, then just agree with me and say boo on him. All right? When we talk about morality, when we talk about religious stuff, right? When we talk about these things, what we're talking about is not science. We're talking about faith, right? And with faith, no one knows, right? Because what's true for you is not true for me and everything else. By the way, does this stuff sound familiar? Have you seen this at work, right? So here we're not talking about facts. We're really talking about feelings. And most Christians believe that. We believe that, you know what, I can't really turn around and say to someone that when I say Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, I have the truth. Because truth only applies to this lower story. And up here, it applies to something completely different. Right? And because Christians have bought those two things. But let me just ask you, when you're saying that, for example, when you're saying that, it's not going to go anywhere. I'll change my mind. Okay, I'll come back to that. Does that make sense? I want you to understand this. Can you see how these two lies are embraced by so many Christians? All right? Now, here's what you need to know. When those of you that are actually in this for the confirmation part of it, where you're actually kind of saying, okay, this is what I'm joining up for. I'm signing up for this. I'm agreeing to this, these things that the church has always taught. This is what you're talking about. Is we're not talking about things that exist up here in this upper esoteric things, a realm of existence, and they're different. This is a false dichotomy. It doesn't actually exist. So when we're saying, do you believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? We're not saying, do you have a feeling that he rose from the dead? It's, did he rise from the dead in history? Did it actually happen? And by the way, if a dead dude came back to life again, that changes everything. All right. Now, because most people don't think worldviewishly, we don't take the... Somebody give me a time check, by the way. Okay. Because we don't actually take our worldview seriously, then most of us then get our worldview like we catch a cold. In other words, we're in a particular environment and we're in a particular culture and it just infects us. So a lot of people basically live this way. We live in a culture where certain actions are considered normal. When those things change, that changes our values. And when those values change, then that changes our worldview. Most people live upside down. The right way to live is to establish, when it comes to those big ultimate questions of life, where did I come from, why am I here? Remember what Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living? Take time to wrestle with those deeply held, with those big questions, those ultimate questions of life. And when you settle on those answers, let that shape your values. And when you settle on that, let that shape your actions. But most people today, and most Christians today, are actually nothing more than victims of the culture. If the cultural winds change, by the way, is anybody here old enough to remember things that were once unthinkable are now unquestionable? Yeah. Pepperidge Farm remembers, right? Remember that commercial? It's a terrible commercial. All right, now we live in a world, and this adds to the whole dynamic, which is that every cultural expression communicates worldview ideas. What I mean by that is every movie, every song, every television show, every political platform, every person testifying in an impeachment hearing is communicating not just their opinions, they're communicating worldview ideas. So if you're not intentional, right? If you're not intentional, if you're not thinking worldviewishly about it, then what ends up happening is we end up getting a worldview that's like a buffet. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, because we live in a culture that's just got so many different ideas coming at us on a daily basis. Here's another way to think about it. Well, I'll tell you a story. Years ago, I used to travel around and speak to high school students at Christian schools. And I would come in, one of the things I would do is I would come in and play what's called the devil's advocate, which means I would pretend to be an atheist, right? So I would come in unintroduced, pretend to be an atheist at this Christian school. And I did it for a couple of reasons. Number one is it lets me use my sin nature for a good cause. And the second reason is because it would bring up a lot of the questions, right? And then you could address these questions about the truthfulness of Christianity. And you never knew where it was going to go. I was at this one school in Virginia, and I was doing it, and then there was this, the students were pathetic. They were really poorly prepared, and it went down, how do you know the Bible's actually true, right? So I would throw out kind of the village atheist, you know, the Bible's a telephone game, and you can't trust what it was saying, and it wasn't protected, and all this sort of stuff. And they were pretty pathetic in the answer. And afterwards, the Bible teacher came up to me, and he was really, really angry with me. And he said, I can't believe you did that to them. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, now I'm going to have to take a whole 2 days to tell them why the Bible can be trusted. That's what he said to me. I was like, glad you know this information now as opposed to when they go to college. But anyway, here was the difference. When I was throwing out kind of the basic, you know, the Bible can't be trusted, these students had never heard these other ideas before. That was probably 15 years ago. The difference between 15 years ago and now is because students watch more YouTube than actual television. Then whenever I do that now, which I don't do it very much anymore, but whenever I do that now, students have already heard all these arguments. Why? Because we live in what historians call the age of information. If you're a mom or a dad here or a grandparent here, here's one of the things you need to know. One of the differences is we used to be able to raise kids in a kind of an ideological, monolithic sort of environment, right? And I tell students it's real easy to believe that God created the world in an environment where everybody else believes God created the world. It's completely different to hold that belief in an environment where to say that out loud means you kind of look like an idiot. We start getting into deeper issues of sexuality, right? What is a male? What is a female? What's the definition of marriage? What's God's rules for sex? It's one thing to believe that in a context where everybody else believes that. If you take that belief into most schools, not to mention colleges, you're not only considered wrong, you're considered evil. And that's a different level of challenge, isn't it? And so because we live in that sort of environment, we've got to be serious about it. Here's what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2. By the way, this is not just a proof text verse. Colossians, the entire book of Colossians, is kind of summed up in this punchline right here in chapter 2, verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So that's what Paul says in Colossians. In his second letter to the church at Corinth, he actually takes it to another level. He says, we walk in the flesh. We are not waging war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. We have divine power to demolish or to destroy strongholds. Some of our brothers and sisters in other denominations take that as kind of the mandate for spiritual warfare, which I think, by the way, that it is. But they see it in terms of casting out a demon here or denouncing a spirit over here. And I think there's probably some legitimacy to some of that. But here's what Paul means. We have divine power to destroy strongholds. So what are we destroying? He actually tells us. What are the strongholds that we're destroying in the very next phrase? We destroy what? Arguments. Yeah, and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Here's the thing. Ideas are weapons used by the enemy. They really are. Ideas really matter. And this is why this right here is so devastating. Because if you think that ideas fit up here in this fluffy little world where you can believe whatever you want and it actually doesn't make any difference, right? No, I'm talking about ideas actually deal with reality. And they make an enormous difference in how we live our lives and how we think and talk about others. Now, if that's what, I was going to do this. This is going to change your life, but I think I'm out of time. So I'm going to move on. I got 15 minutes. How much time? I'm going to ask. How much time? 10? Okay. He's
15.
like, not 15, 10.
No, you could do 15.
I'll give you, this to me is always helpful. One of the ways that you can take ideas captive is to name them. If you know what something is, I think it actually is pretty powerful. And this also, by the way, is something that comes out of the book. So when we talk about the different options, there's only, sorry, let me back up. When you talk about those big ultimate questions, where do we come from, why am I here, what happens when I die, there's really only, and if you talk about how one answer impacts the other, if you're going to be consistent, there's really only a limited number of answers to those questions, right? Because really, all of those questions are answering a more fundamental question, which is, what world do we live in? What is ultimate reality, right? And so one, so here's kind of a way you can kind of hang things. Sorry, let me say that. Here's kind of a way you can hang almost kind of any philosophy that you come across. One is to say that you can really find answers to those questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What's true? What's right and wrong? How do I know? What happens when I die? That you can actually have knowledge about that. You can really know. And that the answer is that ultimate reality is nothing but physical. There's no supernatural. The answers to where did I come from? Natural causes and processes. What's right and wrong? It all exists in this physical world. There's nothing supernatural dictating what's right and wrong. Do you see what I'm saying? And this would be what we would call naturalistic religions or naturalistic worldviews. So this would be atheism, secularisms, communism. That would all fall into this category. The other kind of category of answers would say that, well, the ultimate reality is knowable, but it's spiritual. These religions that say that the physical world is real and the spiritual world is an illusion. But there's also an entirely different group of religions and philosophies and worldviews that say the spiritual world is real and the physical world is really an illusion. So most of your Eastern religions fall into this category, right? The New Age, almost all of Manitou Springs falls into this category. Just go to the shop with the beaded curtain, which is all of them. What I often call Oprahism, which is kind of this your best life now sort of happy clappy, you know what I mean? If you just give positive thoughts, the universe will obey you and give you what you want, right? By the way, this is very, very Western. No one tries the happy thought solution in a war zone or when you're being chased by a lion. But anyway, that's another point. The other category is ultimate reality is knowable, and it basically is the creation of a personal God. This would be Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Obviously, there would be plenty of things that distinguish what they believe, and we'll get into that in just a second. The other option is to say that ultimate reality is unknowable, that we really can't know anything for sure. And this is an idea, this is kind of some things that we see a lot more and more in college campuses and in our public discourse, that ultimate reality is fundamentally unknowable. Everything is a social construct. This would be postmodernism. I think critical race theory, some other things would fit into this category, that basically everything is seen in terms of social construct. But this is a lot deeper than we need to get to for this purpose. But I just wanted you to see where you can kind of categorize ideas, and it could be helpful. Now, let me get to then when we say a Christian worldview, what is it that we mean? Robert Weber, he put it this way: in a culture that we live in where there's so many different ideas, so many different visions of right and wrong, so many different visions of reality that are vying for our hearts and minds, he said the most pressing spiritual issue of our time is who gets to narrate the world. Because when we're talking about these ideas, we're talking about nothing less than what world is it? Here's another way to say it. Why does worldview matter? Because of this fundamental question: in which world do we live? Do we live in the world that Jesus thought? Do we live in, Oprah's world? Do we live in Richard Dawkins' world? Which world do we live in? We're dealing with reality itself. A couple thoughts on a Christian worldview. First of all, Christian worldview is based on truth that is revealed, not self-determined. When you start with the assumption of God, right? Where did everything come from? God. Who sets the rules? God. What's the meaning of the universe? Whatever God says it is. When you start with God, then suddenly you start with a different sort of reality. C.S. Lewis was once asked, what's the most important philosophical statement of all time? And he said, in the beginning, God. Because if that's true, the entire world is a different place. Doesn't that make sense? Suddenly, then, the acquisition of truth is getting what God wants us to get as opposed to making it up. And so a Christian worldview is based on truth that is revealed, not self-determined. Now, you may not like this because we live in a culture in which we're told everything is self-determined, that we get to set the rules, not only about what's true and false, what's right and wrong, what's good for me, not good for me, but even who I am. And this is the battle. I kind of feel like I remember when I was confirmed and Bishop Felix slapped me in the face, because that's what he does, right? Because, you're going into an ideological battle. This is the core of the ideological battle. Does God, I'm going to do that? Anna's looking at me like, wait, he's going to slap me in the face? The point is that all the ideological battles we face come down to, is there a God or is there not a God? If there is a God, he makes the rules, not you. So much of it is that simple. Right now in Michigan, a judge just made a very public statement on local media that's now become national media because she is in a lesbian marriage, and her priest quietly told her, I cannot serve you communion. What's interesting about this story is that the idea that homosexuality is a sin, that if you're willingly engaging in it, disqualifies you from the communion table, has been part of the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church forever. There's nothing new here, right? This is clear. It's right there. Even this pope is clear on that. Okay? And now the judge is coming out saying, the church is being unloving, this is where I was raised, this is where... Do you see how this comes down to this right here? Is Christianity revealed, or do we change it for these new rules? Second, it's centered on Jesus Christ. This is the good news. It's not centered on just a set of moral truths. When we talk about what God ultimately wants us to know about life in the world, here's what God ultimately wants us to know about life in the world. He wants us to know himself. This is what Hebrews said, that at various times in various places God speaks to us in all kinds of ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us in his Son, who completes the law. Here's the third one. It emerges from the biblical story. This is what I love about how I think Father Don brings this up so much, Father Mike brings this up so much, and others, is that when we talk about Christianity, we're not just talking about this kind of random collection of truths. We're talking about a fundamental big story that starts in creation, goes to the fall, tells us of the redemption in Christ, and ends with restoration. By the way, you like that? That's pretty cool, isn't it? Yeah. Stop. You're distracted. There's different ways to tell the biblical story, but that 4-chapter way of telling the whole story is probably the best. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. God created this world. The world you live in is the world God created. Something's gone wrong with this world. God loves the world that he created so much that in Christ he is going to redeem that world and then finally restore it all to the goodness and plan that he had. And that's the story that we're a part of. So when we talk about Christianity, it is personal, how you can be right with God. But how you can be right with God is part of a larger story of how God is renewing and remaking the cosmos that he created and loved. Here's another way to say it. You've never lived in a world that God didn't create. You've never talked to a person that is not made in the image of God. You've never talked to a person that is okay. Every single one of us has a deep flaw inside of us, sin. You've never lived in a world that's headed to catastrophic loss. You live in a world that God is going to make new. That's the story of the world. And you can see, by the way, that story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration answers each and every one of these questions in unique ways. Origin, identity, meaning, morality, and destiny. What's the origin? Where did everything come from? God created it. Who are we? We're made in His image. What's the meaning of life? God creates us for Himself, right? Our hearts are restless, St. Augustine said, until they find their rest in Him. Who makes the rules? God does. Good news is, you can't obey the rules, so God sent Christ to obey the rules for you. It's the answer to the question of morality. And through that, He's going to restore all things, which is destiny. So you can see how that kind of gives us a framework of life in the world. All right. Did I push 10 minutes? 2 minutes. Questions, comments, thoughts? And what I mean by that is one question. Yeah. Yes, and if you buy it, my kids can go to college. So please. Please buy away. It is not for sale out in the lobby, but you can find it on Amazon. So, anything else? Is that a fire hydrant of stuff? Is that too bad? Is that okay? Yes. That's a great question. And I knew I was not going to have time to put everything in, and that's something that's really, really important. Because most people get their worldview like they get sick, most people catch worldview from whatever community or culture they grew up in. So most of us tend to believe what our parents believe. Now, a lot of atheists will throw this at Christians. Say, if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu. To which I say to the atheist, if you were born in India, you'd be a Hindu too. So that doesn't actually solve our problem. Now we've actually got to look at these answers. But because so much about our worldview come out of these kind of rhythms of our life, right? So for example, at this time of year, I'll just give an example. At this time of year, we are convinced by almost every angle of our culture that our fundamental identity as human beings is as consumers. Right? I mean, think about it. The Lexus commercials at Christmas time always get me, right? Because about 2 weeks into December, I'm thinking to myself, I have a Lexus-shaped hole in my heart that only a Lexus can fill. You know what gets me out of that Lexus-shaped hole in my heart that only a Lexus can fill? Is going through the rhythms of Advent. Because what Advent does, and this is why Advent and Lent, I think in particular, are so important, but all the feast days, all the church calendar, is that it gets you in a countercultural rhythm with a different group of people that are continually kind of feeding in, this is what the story is, this is what the story is, this is what the story is. So that means you should go to church, especially during Advent and Lent. All of them. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to throw that one away.